Good afternoon again, and welcome to Be Your Own Spielberg, using storytelling techniques to create highly engaging and impactful presentations with Brian Kloss. This presentation was prepared for the Great Lakes PTTC under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this webinar are the views of the speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services. The PTTC network believes that words matter and uses affirming language in all activities. I want to share some housekeeping items with you. If you have technical issues during the webinar, please individually message me, Rebecca Buller, or Chris Gabrielson in the chat section at the bottom of your screen, and we will be happy to assist you. If captions or live transcript would be helpful, please use your Zoom toolbar near the bottom of your screen and choose live transcript. With regard to AI note taker options, we do not allow this for several reasons, and we'll ask you to disengage it if you activate one. And if you do not, you will be removed from the Zoom room. If you have questions for the speaker, we ask that you put those in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat. With this many people, we could very easily lose your question, and we don't want to do that. At the end, you will be redirected to a short survey. It takes about 3 minutes to complete it, and it helps us improve our offerings and report to our funders. And finally, certificates of attendance will be sent out via email to all who attended this webinar in full, and it can take up to 2 weeks to receive those. And now I want to turn things over to our presenter, Brian Kloss.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. I just want to give a quick shout out to the folks who are joining us today from Columbus, Ohio. My grandparents lived there for 40 years. I have so many fond memories of Columbus and going to Bob Evans and playing in the creek. And it was great summertime memories that I had. California, where I grew up, is very different than Ohio. So it was a lot of fun for me. I'm going to share my screen. We can go ahead and get started. All right. Let's just dive right in, shall we? I like doing that. Not a lot of ceremony. But it's great to see everybody here. Thank you for being here. And more people from Ohio. Excellent. All right. Let's get started. So we live in an attention economy. Multiple modes of input, different sources of information, different stimulus, desire, biochemical responses are competing for our attention, my attention, your attention. I'm competing right now with email that might be popping up on your computer, lunch, right? If you haven't had lunch yet or eating right now, or information pouring in on our devices, whether they're phones or laptops. And whether we sort of recognize it or not, we're kind of being conditioned to spend less time holding focus on a single task and more time going from one quick casual reward to another. That's why games like Fortnite and even Wordle are still so popular, right? You pick them up, you play for a few minutes, you put them down and walk away. Feeling splendid if you solve the Wordle fast enough. That's usually where I get on Wordle, is the splendid line. And even though my kids tell me that Fortnite's dead, the average game of Fortnite is less than like 20 minutes, and there's still millions and millions of people who play the game every day. And we kind of live today in especially when it comes to reading, we kind of live in a too long didn't read, TLDR culture, too long didn't read. We want people to summarize things for us. We're actually training our brains when we read, particularly on digital devices, we're training our brains to skip sentences in the second half of paragraphs. Cory Doctorow is a researcher and lecturer at Harvard. He's done a lot of research on this, and he's shown how when we read paragraphs, particularly in an online setting, whether it's a journal article or a newspaper article or whatever it is, we tend to read like the first or second sentence and skip everything else because we've trained because like the first and second sentence have the key information, but the third, fourth, fifth, and so on sentences, that's just supporting. And we've learned, skip over that, right? We want information faster, and we want it in bite-sized chunks. But the primary way in which information at at schools, colleges, universities, webinars, community events, work conferences. The primary way that information is delivered in these environments hasn't changed in a really long time. And this is running up against the way in which we, and certainly our audiences, are receiving that information. Our expectations about how we receive information and shape our time have changed, but the way that we deliver condensed information in presentations to community partners or to the public largely has not. Yeah, Katrina, I'm a big fan of Cory Doctorow. Definitely a big fan of his work. So the upshot of all this is that it usually makes presentations feel really boring. This is probably you after 5 minutes of listening to someone talk at you in a classroom or on Zoom, or after you've spent 4 hours online in an online conference, for those of you who ever attended an online conference. But presentations are still important. Presentations are valuable because they allow us to distill the most important things our audience needs to know into meaningful chunks without making them wade through encyclopedic readings or books. They help our audiences, our colleagues, our project partners know what's important. They have value, but they are problematic. Now, before I get any further, I'd like to ask you a question. And for these, you can just type in the text chat. This isn't a Q&A thing. There's no poll quite just yet. I want to ask you first, in your experience, your professional and educational experience, what makes for a good presentation? What makes for a good presentation or a good presenter? If you could type that into the text chat, I would love to see that from you. Okay, we've got relatability, engagement, passion, opportunities to participate, right? Dynamic speaking, gets to the point, very important. What do we got? Visual aids, using different mediums. Honesty, totally agree with that, Lillian. Honesty and vulnerability are so important, and yet, particularly in the clinical environment, we're told time and again, don't be vulnerable, don't show emotion, let the data speak for itself. Not true. What else do we got? Interactive, visuals, yeah, all these things, practical, simple, animated, free food. Donovan, I totally agree. I'm much more likely to go to an in-person event if I know there's free food there. Relevant stories, humor, dynamic. Yeah, so these are all great things. Knowing the topic, absolutely. You got to know what you're talking about. Switching it up, passion, Charlie, 100%. Passion, new information you didn't know before. These are all great. Yeah, these are all things that make for a good presentation. And I hope that today, really one of my main goals of being with you today, and again, thanks to Chris and everyone at the center for inviting me to speak here today. Really, one of my goals is to try to give you techniques that you can use to go out and increase audience engagement and retention of information in your presentations, primarily by using techniques from the movies. I love movies, I love theater, I love books, I love narrative. Narrative is kind of my life. It's what I research, it's what I teach. I really hope that after today or from today's presentation, you're going to think differently about designing and delivering presentations. And I'm not going to be here, I'm not going to argue about presentations being the best method to reach every single audience. But they're a fact of life, right? They're a fact of the life in the work that we do. They're everywhere and they serve a purpose. So let's figure out how we can make them better, how we can keep our audiences engaged, and how to get them to remember more of what you share. But before I get into that, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I am extraordinarily lucky to work at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I've worked there for, gosh, over 30 years now. It's kind of crazy. I love it there. I'm very lucky. I teach courses on communication, health science communication to non-expert audiences. I also have kind of this weird, I was explaining to Rebecca at the start of the presentation, I live in this intersection between the humanities and computer science. I have a computer science background. I've spent many years building large scale cloud architectures for educational environments. But what I really focus on now is teaching and teaching health science communication. But a long time ago, back when I was in college, many years ago now, I was an English and theater double major. That was my major. And I was not an actor. I'm a terrible actor, terrible. But I was pretty good at the directing thing. And I fell in love with narrative and storytelling. And so when I graduated from college, I really had 3 career goals. The first one was to work in the regional theater circuit, which I did for a couple of years. I worked at Seattle Repertory Theater, among other places across the country. The second was to have and run my own theater company, which I did for about a decade here in Baltimore, a professional theater company that unfortunately went under post September 11th, when a lot of funding that went to the arts shifted over to 9/11 related charities. And my third goal was to direct on Broadway, and I didn't get to do that goal. And my theater did close after a decade, but I don't look at this time as failure in my life. It's not at all, because ultimately it led me to two kind of key principles that really guide me in how I teach, and the work that I do in computer science and software development and all that good stuff. And really, so there's sort of two key principles. And the first one is that learning is narrative. Learning is narrative. We take our audience that we're speaking to when we teach them from one understanding of the world to another. We lead them on a journey from point A to point B to point C with a shell of a script. And we tell a story when we teach people. And that story changes the way that our audience understands how they interact with the world. They gain new knowledge, they gain a new experience that shifts how they understand who they are and how they interact with the world around themselves. And narrative itself gives meaning to facts, right? Narrative is the context. It's the story that you tell them, your audience, that why something is important. It hopefully keeps them engaged and ideally gets them to want to know more. Narrative gives meaning to facts. Facts are great. Facts are real. Facts are important. But facts can't speak for themselves. If they could, we'd ask them to write all of our papers and journal articles and emails for us, right? But narrative is what gives meaning to fact. And narrative itself shapes processing, retention, and desire. How you tell is as important as what you tell. It has a measurable impact on information processing. Cognitive neuroscience in the last 2 decades has shown that different parts of the brain light up when you tell stories versus just stating facts and information. And the different phases of creating memory is absolutely affected by how that information is fed into our brain. There's 4 phases of creating memory. Attention, encoding, storage, and retrieval. And those first 2 phases, attention and encoding, are absolutely affected by how we feed information, how we show, relate, display, carry on, whatever, disseminate information to other people. So it absolutely makes a big difference. And this is a really important point. Sensory and emotional cues shape narrative. Right? Sensory and emotional cues shape narrative. And there's lots of research on how different kinds of sensory and emotional cues affect our body and how we remember things and form memories. So the shape of a space can absolutely affect us. How many times have you been like on a plane or a bus or even in a classroom or an office or a conference room, and you're like crammed next to the people who are right next to you, and you can feel them touching you all the time? Well, you can't focus on your book or what the person who's talking is saying, because your body is constantly getting these emotional and sensory cues about touch, and I feel trapped. I feel closed in. Color is really important in the shape of a space. This is why fast food restaurants tend to use light colors, whites, yellows, bright reds, right? Those are the 3 colors of the old McDonald's, or In-N-Out, for those of you who are familiar with In-N-Out, because it's energy. They want you to get in and out, no pun intended, of that restaurant as fast as they can. Whereas upscale restaurants tend to use more muted colors because it makes you calm, it makes you want to stay there and buy more alcohol, which is how most upscale restaurants make their money. Sound is super important. You know, it takes 2 notes in the movie Jaws to set up a villain, narrative tension, and drive. And if you've heard those 2 notes, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? But you hear those notes, and like, if you've ever seen that movie, for the rest of your life, you're like, I'm gonna get eaten by a shark as soon as you hear those notes, right? Visual composition absolutely affects how we process information. I'm gonna talk quite a bit about visual composition a little bit later on. You know, psychologists have shown us time and again that we are engaged by and more likely to recall things that appeal to multiple senses at the same time. So if we can tap into our limbic system, which is sort of like located here at the base of our brain, just above the brain stem, we can have really powerful retention of information, not just for 5 minutes or 5 months or 5 days, but 5 years, right? I mean, it's for a really long time. And the second principle that I try to go by when I can is that design is important. The look and feel of things is important. How you lay things out on the screen is important. I'm going to talk about that. It tells a story as much as your content does. You know, we largely organize our emotional experience with narrative around visual cues. It's been 25, 26 years, but I can still remember in the movie Titanic, that amazing shot. So after all the chaos of the ship being hit by the iceberg and sinking and breaking in half, and the chaos and the noise of each half starting to sink and go below the water, and Jack saying, "Rose, don't let go, don't let go." All that noise, it cuts to this incredible shot that starts with a couple of people splashing in the water, calling out for help. And it pulls back and pulls back and pulls back until you see hundreds, if not 1,000 people splashing and screaming in the freezing North Atlantic because they know they're going to die. It's been 25 years, and it still affects me to this day. Hollywood spends billions of dollars every year to manipulate us through the full spectrum of design techniques they have at their disposal. If you saw the movie Avengers, Infinity War, what's the story of Avengers Infinity War? Well, you could boil it down to man collects stones. But that's not what we remember, right? Or Barbie, right? The movie Barbie last year, if you saw it, doll embraces imperfection. That's not the experience that we have at all, right? Because we are manipulated through these amazing design techniques by the artists who work in Hollywood. And we live in a design-attuned world, right? These devices, right? These devices are important to us. The colors, our cases, our home screens. Target Boutique, Target built an empire in the early 2000s with the motto, design for all. And it's not just the things that we touch or the clothes that we buy or the household items we buy. It's also the interfaces through which we interact, the screens through which we get information and interact with on our phones, on our laptops every single day. And we're not all great natural-born storytellers, but we are expected when we present to entertain and hold our audience's attention at conferences or with community partners. And we're not all great natural-born storytellers. I'm not at all. But there are ways that we can present and structure information which facilitates that storytelling process. Because I think we need to treat every presentation we give like a Hollywood production with Hollywood production values, not content values, that's a different story entirely, but production values. We need to think about how we direct and design our production, because this has a measurable impact on the audience's ability to process, retain, and synthesize information for problem solving later on. Because if all you do is just post the same PowerPoint that you ever did, you've walked into one of the biggest traps in presenting, and education, in my opinion, as well. This is a trap. PowerPoint is a trap. It's a trap. For those of you looking for your Star Wars Admiral Akbar reference, there you go. It's a trap. It makes it really easy to dump information quickly, but not effectively. So can anyone tell me, just real quick, if you know it off the top of your head, you can type it in the text chat. What's the basic template in PowerPoint? You click that new slide button in PowerPoint. What are the things that come up on the screen? Like as soon as you click new slide, anybody? If you can think about it, type in the text chat there. Title content, title and text, title and bullets. Yeah, right? Title content. So what did you see in every single one of your presentations in high school? Title and bullets. What did you see in every one of your presentations in college? Title and bullets. What do you see at most conferences you go to? Title and bullets, right? This is not effective information dissemination, but it is a phenomenon known as functional fixedness in psychology. So functional fixedness means we use things as they are first presented to us. So through most of our educational career, we saw title and bullets, and so that's what we think a PowerPoint presentation is supposed to be. And it's not. It's not effective information dissemination. If you take nothing else at all, okay, Kurt, I'm glad that you probably had like the pen on acetate, right? I remember that stuff. That was good. But if you take nothing else away from this presentation, when you're building a presentation the next time, start outside PowerPoint. Don't use PowerPoint. Pick up a piece of paper and write on it. Use a plain text editor. Seriously, my students, it's one of the things they come back and tell me time and again was one of the most valuable things I learned from you was not starting in PowerPoint when I present, is to start outside on a piece of paper or a text editor or something like that. So that's just one thing to take away up front. All right, another question for you. I'm going to shift gears in a minute here. Another question for you. So you probably watch shows, stuff on Netflix or Max, or you go to the movies, you read books, maybe even go to plays. I love plays. Whatever it is, you probably encounter stories on a regular basis. For you, as an audience member, what are the elements of a good story? What are the elements of a good story? What makes you want to keep watching a show on Apple TV or Netflix? Or what makes a movie really meaningful to you? All right. Good plot, a relatable protagonist, absolutely. Plot twist, suspense, intrigue, building tension, absolutely, Brenda. Lindsay says drama, twist. Lots of people are on like twists and not predictable. I'm not going to teach you how to do like, true crime mystery, although I've seen, you probably could do one of your narratives, one of your presentations, a true crime mystery, and a lot of people would be into that. Actually, I've had students do that, and it's a great technique for getting the audience engaged. Let's see, intrigue, comedy, suspense, good character development. Yeah, a hook, realistic, captivating, absolutely. All of these things make for good, brilliant actors, totally agree. So yeah, absolutely. These are all, yeah, Criterion Collection, Katrina, 100%. So many great movies there. So lots of elements of good stories. Yeah, I totally agree. And I'm going to talk about some of these right now. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and spend a good chunk of time talking about techniques from film and from the stage to make your delivery when you present more engaging and also increase audience information over time. Now, these techniques, honestly, have been used for thousands of years, since the time of the Greeks or epic Indian theater. They're also in literature and film and plays and books, all the sort of things. They really do work. And I'm not going to say, and in no way am I going to say that you need to use all these techniques in every single presentation. Not at all. But figure out what works best for you and think about how you might use some of these techniques in your presentations. All right. So first up is conflict, right? This is suspense. This is twist. This is, not knowing what's going to happen next, right? Conflict. Conflict is the cornerstone of narrative. It really is. Narrative without conflict is boring, right? Jaws without the shark would be a lovely day on Martha's Vineyard, but not very interesting to watch, and certainly not a movie I would sit and watch and pay to watch for 2.5 hours. So always ask and explain to your audience what the obstacle is that needs to be overcome. What stories can I, as a professional in this field, tell about something that I experienced or something that I know happened that will frame my issue through conflict? Because conflict drives engagement, it creates meaning for your audience, and it helps to structure your presentation, right? Background, problem, solution. Really simple, really effective 3-act structure, right? Very nice structure if you focus on conflict. So position problems in the foreground and then show how they can be overcome, or in the case of an intractable problem, let's say like global poverty, what needs to be worked on to make things better. So conflict is the first one. The second one, this is another thing a lot of people talked about, character. Interesting characters. We're all actually pretty interesting when you get right down to it. We all have interesting things about ourselves and stories that we could share with one another. And when I started working in public health at the Bloomberg School of Public Health a long time ago, one of the faculty who's still there, she's amazing. Her name is Marie Diener West. She's a biostatistician. She explained to me that public health was or is about people. Public health is about people. Cool, right? Because it's about populations, groups of people, not just a person. Medicine's about one-on-one person. Public health is about people. Cool. Well, nanobiotechnology is about people. Economics is about people. Statistics is about people. Art history is about people. Addiction and drug use abatement is about people. Everything is about people. So talk about people. Talk about people that you've worked with. Talk about people who did major discoveries. Talk about people who worked on the research. There's always interesting things to share about these, about people, and show them, show faces, show people in your presentations, including yourself. Be on camera. Don't be that person who's like, I don't like being on camera, so I'm just going to turn it off while I give this presentation. That's going to significantly disengage your audience, because from the time we are babies, from the time we're infants, we focus and fixate on faces, even our own. That's one of the big problems of tools like Zoom or Teams, is we're constantly wanting to see how we look, right? So we're always looking at ourselves, but focus on people. Because for lasting effect, whenever you give a presentation, not only do you have to persuade the rational brain that something is true through facts and data, but you also have to resonate with the emotional brain. So tell stories about the people behind the research, behind the discoveries. Draw people into your visualizations, your data visualizations, your charts. If you are talking about, for example, opioid addiction rates, and you start off by telling a story of Julia, who was a real estate agent who lost everything because of her opioid addiction, and you're talking about in charts, like look at the rate of fentanyl use in the United States and how it shoots up. Point to where Julia is. Say, like, Julia is here. This is when Julia became addicted. Because people are going to remember, your audience is more likely to remember people than mathematical or statistical abstractions. So focus on people whenever you can. All right, next up, pace. Pace is, in many ways, the most important tool a director has in their arsenal for shaping narrative and the emotional experience. Pace is a key tool in maintaining audience engagement. And it also has to do with, as some of you said, I asked what makes for a good presentation, talked about mixing it up, right? Mixing it up. Pace is absolutely part of this. So just like acts in a play or in a movie script, movies have acts, TV shows have acts, or chapters in a book, you really want to work to chunk your content into logical sections whenever possible. Logical sections of content that are clearly distinct from one another. Because it's hard for us to pay attention to the same topic for a long period of time. By now, you're probably all struggling a little bit to pay attention to me in this webinar, because the human brain craves novelty. It craves novelty all the time. And if it's not getting what it's needed, it's going to find it elsewhere. And we are often find ourselves in training or teaching environments where we do have to sit for a half hour, an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours, 3-hour doctoral seminars. Man, if I never do another one of those again, that's all too soon. It's hard for us to pay attention. And we know this because there's a lot of research around this. So the US Navy did a study of their commissioned officers, and they wanted to know, these are people who had been through, the basic training, who had been to, the Naval Academy here in Annapolis, Maryland. And so these are people who live in life and death situations. If they can't pay attention and focus for long periods of time, their lives could literally be on the line. And so they want to know, okay, in a training environment, how long can these people who are trained to pay attention actually pay attention, right? How long can they pay attention? So I'm launching a poll here. If you could vote in the poll, I'll show you the results in just a second here, but go ahead and vote in the poll. And before they had significant mind wandering or lack of information retention. That's really what they wanted to know. And I'll give everybody just a minute to answer. Again, thinking about the context, these are naval officers. These aren't, 14-year-old kids in a classroom. Okay, I'll just give it one more second. I know some folks are voting. It's fun. That's the fun part of doing polls with 301 participants, is like, not everyone gets to vote right away, and it takes a minute for everyone to catch up. And I do want to give people a chance to vote here, but I'm going to end it in 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. All right, so here's what you all thought. And so it looks like most of you thought 11 minutes or 5 minutes was the second most popular option. And then followed by 18, 23, and then 37 minutes at the last one. If you missed the poll, it's not a big deal, I promise. So anyways, the correct answer from this study was 18 minutes. 18 minutes for them to be able, these trained officers, to pay close attention. This study was done in 1972. So you can imagine with devices like these, that number has dropped precipitously, and it has. John Medina, he's a biologist and sort of human behavior researcher out of University of Washington. He studied his 4.0 type A super driven graduate students, and he found that they could be they could only pay attention for 10 minutes. That was it. 10 minutes before there was significant mind wandering and lack of information retention. So it's really mixing it up, as some of you have said, is really important. And thinking about how we chunk our content. So after about 10 minutes or so, you really do want to move on to something else. Yeah, 10 minutes. Yeah, that's about it. That's generally what we recommend. Yeah, so let's see. So mountaineers, not military. You studied Katrina. Yeah, it would be the same sort of thing. You've got to pay attention if you want to survive, right? Classrooms, community partners, very low stakes, low pressure, but still the same basic principle applies. And when it comes to an individual slide, you generally don't want to spend more than about 2 minutes on a slide. At Bloomberg School of Public Health, we have a Center for Teaching and Learning, and they do lots of data analysis in terms of like when students watch pre-recorded lectures and tools like Panopto or other tools that we have, they find that most students will stop watching a slide after about 2 minutes and they'll just skip ahead. Because in most cases, A, the faculty have put all of the information they need to know directly on the slide, or B, the main points have been made and they want to move on. Right? A faster pace is going to help pull your audience in. We all know, like reading a slow book or watching a movie that is like a super slow burn or slow pace, it's hard to have that engagement, right? But you also want to strike that balance between quick and slow, but because if you're going fast all the time, it's hard to keep up. I mean, I'm sure we've all been there where you're in a presentation that's supposed to last for an hour. The presenter has 128 slides in their deck, and they just race through the last 30 slides in the last 3 minutes because they want to get through it all before their time ends. That's so disrespectful to your audience. It really is. You definitely disrespectful. All right, moving on. Yeah, Katrina, you're right. It is very different in terms of that kind of life or death situation because, yeah, you have to be, right, as opposed to a classroom where you don't have to be that into it. But it's a really, I'm actually curious about that study. So, yeah, Christine, okay, so sorry, this is a small digression. I just gave a presentation about a month ago to students who are graduating in the Master of Public Health and the Master of Science in Public Health programs at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. And they all have to give a capstone presentation. They do a capstone project before they get their degree, and they have to give a capstone presentation. And I asked, and they said, well, give us a presentation on how to do things better, right? The students were like, can you come talk to us, tell us how to give a better capstone presentation? And I said, okay, I'm going to go first to all the faculty who sit in and evaluate these presentations. And I asked them, what's one piece of advice that you would give your students who are giving presentations? And they all said, get to the good stuff. Don't spend forever on the background. Get into the key information. You only got 9 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever they have to give their presentations. Get to the good stuff. I couldn't agree with that more, Christine. I do a little bit of background, not too much, just to guide people in, but I agree with that as well, because everyone's time is precious and valuable, and you don't want to run out of time at the end. And I'll talk about how you can avoid running out of time a little bit later on as well. But let me shift gears here now to talk about composition. And this is really a bit more practical, less theoretical. It's really about how you lay out your slides. And really, the key point I want to make here is that we want to help our audience, our learners, figure out, or focus on the key piece of information you want them to be looking at in that moment, and not make them kind of constantly scan and decipher what they should be looking at. That's what this section is really about. So Jacob Nielsen is a human-computer interaction expert. He has been working in the field for probably 40 years now, believe it or not. And his research has really shown that there is an implicit hierarchy of topics when you especially present using slides or on a screen. There's an implicit hierarchy of topics. And this comes from a number of different factors, but essentially we in the West read in an F-shaped pattern when we're processing information on screens. We start in the upper left corner, we go across, we go down a little bit, we go across, and we continue on down the left side of the page. We pretty much ignore everything on the right side of screens. Anyone want to take a guess as to why we've sort of trained ourselves to ignore things on the right side of screens? What generally appears when you're browsing a website, looking at a web page? What's on the right side of the screen? Anyone? Ads, right? Yes. Well, the clock is on the right, on the far right, yes. But when you're looking at a web page, generally ads are there, right? And pop-ups and all those things that annoy us. So we learned to tune that out, completely tune that out. So there is this F-shaped pattern. And if your most important point is the last point, say, in a bullet list, the impact of that important point is going to be diminished because it's at the bottom of the screen where people look least and look last. So you want to think about how you organize information on the screen. This study that Jakob Nielsen did, he did it originally in 2006. He replicated it in 2012, I'm sorry, and then did it again in 2016. Each time, same results. The things people remembered were in the top right corner, and then everything else, especially the bottom of the screen, had much lower memorability. And it is people in the West, Trish. She focused on people who speak primarily Romance languages for the most part, because as we know, a number of like Chinese, Mandarin, Thai, those are left Japanese, top to bottom, or Arabic, left to right. And Hebrew is also, I'm sorry, right to left, not left to right, like we read in the West. So yeah, so top right corner is where our eyes go first. Yeah, absolutely. So we need to think about how we organize information on the screen. So here's an example. This is a great illustration about decluttering your life and organizing your life, right? There's a monkey, there's a penguin, there's a non-scary clown hanging out in the corner here. But if I say, okay, take a look where it talks about drawers and sheds and garages, you've got to scan this whole thing a couple of times before you're like, ah, there it is. And you're not paying attention to me. You're not focusing on what I'm saying, when I'm talking in this. You might miss something really important because there's just a lot to process here, right? There's a lot to process. So for me, if I'm going to talk about decluttering an organization, this is a lot more effective. Because when it comes to visual information, oftentimes, unless you're dealing with an audience of true experts, and I mean true experts in their field, less is almost always more. Less is almost always more. And I know I put this in the lower right corner of the screen, but sometimes rules are meant to be broken. And actually the lower right corner of the screen makes it feel a little more sort of sad and lonely and isolated. So that's why I put it there. Putting everything you need to say or everything you want to cover on a topic on a single slide might be convenient for you, but it negatively impacts pace and it negatively impacts focus. And I've heard this referred to as the toxicity of information overload. And cognitive science, again, has shown us that too much information on the screen is really an overload. It impacts our attention and it impacts processing. And this most frequently shows up in presentations all the time with people reading off their slides, reading bullet by bullet by bullet by bullet. And I'll tell you, you are not the hare in this race. We pretty much all read faster than an individual can talk, even me as a fast talker, certainly in academia, certainly in the community of science. Please stop reading your slides. Because if everything your audience needs to know is on your slides, then why do you need to be there? Why are you presenting? Seriously. Slides should be there to reinforce what you're saying, not be everything that is necessary to know about the topic or the presentation. And if you're dumping data, why are you not just giving people a document rather than giving them a presentation, right? If it's table after table, chart after chart, just give them a document. It's going to be much more effective for their learning and their processing based on how they want to do that, rather than you like going after complex table, graph chart, complex table, graph chart over and over again. Yeah, it is rough, Brenda. It is rough when the presenter reads the slides, 1000%. And I know this is hard. I know this is hard because people are like, but what do I do? I can't remember everything I'm going to say. What if I get a piece of data wrong? What if I get a fact wrong, a number wrong? I get it. I am terrified of getting stuff wrong. Most people are. No one wants to look like a fool. Anyways, and the great thing you can do is use your notes for that. Leave all that textual detail, all those dates, all those facts, all those links, all those specific names to your handouts. Put them in your notes, Leave them in your notes. I live and die on my PowerPoint notes. I do, or I should say my Keynote notes, because I use Keynote for most of my presentations, like I'm doing here today. I go back and forth between the two. I just like Keynote more. But it's very easy to turn your PowerPoint notes into handouts for your audience. Yeah, right, exactly. No one knows what you didn't say, but you can always circle back. Absolutely. Christine, yeah, I could provide the notes if you're interested in seeing my notes for this, if you'd like. So you can turn notes into handouts. I've seen some people who do like a skip slide thing where they have one slide that contains just what they want the audience to see, and the next slide with all the notes and the details that they have there. So they kind of like skip a slide, but it can show up still in the PowerPoint presenter view as well. Yeah, Katrina, it is torture. It is torture when people just read to you. I'm sorry, it's disrespectful. We're adults, and oftentimes when we present to community partners, I teach at graduate level education, even undergraduate, even high school. They're young adults. They don't need to be read to at all. It's really, really disrespectful. And by the way, if on your slide you're trying to cram in information and you're using font sizes less than 36 point, you're doing it wrong. Let me repeat that. If you're using font sizes less than 36 point, you're doing it wrong. I mean, how many times have you sat in an auditorium or a classroom or a lecture hall or a meeting room, and there's this tiny text and they're like, see where it says here? And you're like, no, I can't even read that. You know, I'm 55. I can read on my screen up close, but without glasses, I can't read what's 6 feet in front of me, especially when it's tiny, tiny little text. You know, each slide is just bits and bytes. I think there's this sort of legacy that we carry over from the 80s and 90s where everyone used to print everything out. Remember those days when you used to print everything out, right? Well, and you're like, well, I can't have slides with just a couple words because that's going to be a waste of paper. Well, these days, not many people print stuff out. Certainly not in the way that we used to, right? On the mimeograph machine, absolutely. So, you know, this doesn't necessarily apply to citations. You want your citations to be small, out of the way, not intrusive. But by and large, if it's a key idea, key point, anything less than 36 point is really going to make it difficult for people with low vision issues and generally people who are a little bit older than, say, the age of like 25, 30 to be able to read it. All right. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, so Brian says don't put anything on your slides, have pictures, a couple words, nothing else. No data, right? No data. Data is important, data is critical, but we also, as presenters, need to be critical about how much data we show. We need to help our audience focus on the right piece of data at the right time. Frequently, especially in the health sciences, there's this assumption that our audience has a statistical knowledge set that they often simply don't have. Many people don't really remember their calculus. They don't know what standard deviations are. They don't know what box and whisker plots represent. None of that stuff, right? So we really need to be critical about the kind of data that we show and making sure it's easy for our audience to process that data. And we can better clarify our message by simplifying the presentation. Again, you don't need to have long bullet lists. You can split it apart on multiple slides. Just put a little, like, title is the head of the title of the bullet list. That's all. But more importantly, edit ruthlessly. And I mean ruthlessly. Unless you're doing a PhD dissertation defense, your audiences don't need encyclopedic knowledge. And this is hard to do. This is so hard to do. All great directors suffer from the too much syndrome. Martin Scorsese makes movies that I could never make in my wildest dreams. He is amazing. He's incredible. But he suffers from the too much syndrome. Killers of the Flower Moon was an awesome movie, but it was also an hour too long. The Irishman was a great movie that should have been 3 episodes in a Netflix series. It was too much. It was too long to process in a single sitting. And we often find this also in what we call, now the era of mid-TV, where they take a storyline and they stretch it out to 10 episodes when it should have been 4 or 6. We need to edit ruthlessly and get rid of what's not really, truly necessary for our audience to know. No one's going to care, right? They're not going to care that you left something out. You're like, you might be, but I left this out. Well, you know what? If it's not key to your key ideas, leave it out. And we can use PowerPoint or Keynote or Prezi or Google presentations, whatever you use, as a camera like a film camera, to reduce complexity of what's on the screen, to help us process the story and not the presentation of the story. We can use very simple tools in PowerPoint and other software to drill down and pull out key data points in complex visuals. So this is not the most complex visual in the world. But if I said to you, I want you to look at 1987 because this is a really important year because this was a year in which blah, 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 and you're looking for an 87, and you got to take a couple seconds and you're like, oh, there it is. But if instead I just sort of put a simple PowerPoint shape around the exact spot I want you to look, you don't got to do the work. You don't have to do the work. It's very, very simple. You're focusing on me, on what I'm saying. You're staying in my story instead of sort of looking around and being like, where is this? And this is a simple visualization. We've all worked with visualizations that are a lot more complicated with this. If I want to show a whole series, I can put a box to highlight the whole series. Again, this shape took me 3 seconds to add, but it makes all the difference in the world in terms of my audience being able to stay focused and be engaged with the story I'm sharing with them. If I want to provide sort of fade other parts out, I can use like negative space, right? Put covering boxes, white boxes or gray boxes to fade out the parts of an infographic or data that I don't want my audience to focus on, and it achieves these same goals. These are really simple, simple tools, simple shapes you can add. They take seconds to add, and they make a huge difference in your audience's ability to focus. Same thing with tables. Please don't use a laser pointer. Please, if you're in an in-person event, don't use a laser pointer. There's 2 major problems. First, most laser pointers are red. Lots and lots of people have red-based color blindness. They can't see what you're pointing at. And the other part of the problem with the laser pointer, in terms of pointing out something on a complex visual, is that it's constantly in motion. Constantly. Even if you do your best to hold that laser pointer still, it's still going to be moving up and down. You might be nervous. Your hand might be shaking. Just by talking. By talking, your body moves. And that red dot bounces. And we survived as human beings. We evolved and survived as human beings because we have amazing peripheral vision and an amazing ability to see small changes in movement. So when you're holding that laser pointer trying to show something on a complex visualization, our brains are going, oh, look over there, look over there, look over there, look over there, and not really paying attention to what you're talking about. So again, you can use simple shapes like highlighting bars or boxes to let the audience focus on the exact thing you need to see at that moment in time. Okay, so really, this is really about showing the right detail at the right time to your audiences. And the tools built into PowerPoint or Keynote or Google Presentations or Prezi all allow you to focus the attention on the right detail at the right time and help to clarify your message. They're really easy to add. Please use them. Please use them. All right, off of composition. Last thing I'm going to talk about in terms of techniques is reflection. So activities which encourage or directly sponsor reflection significantly increase audience engagement. Reflection really is the heart of all art. Whether it's film or theater or sculpture or dance or music, the question of how does this relate to me? How do I understand this as an individual person? And if you can do things that get people to think about the topic and reflect on it, if you can get them to think about how this might apply to them personally through stories or examples, they're much more likely to remember what you say, and in case of persuasiveness, to be more moved to action on the issue. And the easiest way to do this is just ask a question. Seriously, do not be afraid of asking questions. It's so simple to do. It gets your audience thinking, it gets them engaged, and takes really little effort to design into your presentation. This is great to do at the start of a presentation. There was a study from UC Davis back in 2014 that showed when our curiosity is piqued at the beginning of a sort of lecture style presentation, it stimulates our hippocampus here, down here in the lower part of our brain, and gets us ready to learn and helps us remember more, not just about the primary information that's shared, but also incidental information that's shared as well. So ask a question, super easy to do. And then personal reflection, your own personal stories are great. The aha moments you had in your career, in your education, in a project, in implementing an intervention, moments of conflict and then conflict resolution. These are all emotional points from which information retention is based. Conflict and troubles and stories of triumph or failure help us to connect to our audience. They make us vulnerable. They make us human. And when we meet somebody You know, a lot of times in sort of that initial judgment of a person, we want to know, how do you speak to me as a fellow human? And stories are powerful because they are meaningful to all of us. Yeah. Yeah, so Michelle, I think asking what do you hope to get out from this presentation? Absolutely. I kind of did that today, right? I asked you, what do you think makes for a good presentation? Because I wanted to see what you thought, get you thinking about it, get you relating to the topic at hand. And it also helps me draw parallels back to those comments where people said, oh, an engaging speaker, surprise, visual design, mixing it up, all those things. So yeah, you can start with that. Absolutely. And someone asked a question, Dominic, in the Q&A, I promise you, I promise, I will get to your question about how important are introductions at the beginning of a presentation. I will get to that. I promise you, because it's such a good question and such a trap that's so easy to fall into. Okay. So what? So what? I've talked about this, right? At this point, you probably think this is great, but how do I actually put this into practice, right? The visual stuff about like less on your slides, fine. It looks nicer. But what about the stuff about character and conflict and stories? How do I do that? I'm not a writer. I'm not a fiction writer. I'm not a screenwriter. How do I do that in my presentations? I have an answer for you. Narrative frameworks, and in particular, the Pixar storytelling framework. The Pixar storytelling framework will help you structure your ideas and help you pitch an idea for someone else to buy into, pitch a program, talk about an implementation and intervention. It's applicable in lots of different health science contexts. Real quick, what's your favorite Pixar movie? Just really curious. I was going to do a poll and I'm like, wait, there's like 37 movies and that's like too many. So what's your favorite Pixar movie? If you don't like Pixar movies, you can say that too. But what's your favorite Pixar movie? Let's see what comes up. I'm just really curious. Up, Wall-E, Nemo, Incredibles. That's my number one. Incredibles is my number one. The first one, not the second one. Wall-E, love Wall-E. Cars, my kids love Cars. Toy Story. Bugs Life, absolutely. See, these are all great movies. Inside Out 2 was so much better than I thought it was going to be, Ashley. I really, I think part of the reason why it resonates so deeply with people is because that last scene of anxiety, having that attack was so powerful and so true. And same thing, Cara, Inside Out 1. When I met my husband, one of our first dates that we did with the kids was we went to see Inside Out, the first one. And he bawled like a baby, as did I, because we had kids and we understood that joy and sadness are really, like quite literally, opposites from one another. And I knew he was a good person and a good father because of that. Like that was like some weird litmus test I had for him there. So yeah, there's a lot of great. Monsters University, also a good one. I liked Elemental, Lindsay. I know a lot of people are like, whatever. I actually really liked it a lot. So yeah, no spoiler alert. Sorry, Shelby. I don't think I ruined anything. Hopefully I didn't ruin anything for you, Shelby. My bad. Anyways, all right. So I love Pixar movies, and there is a framework, there is a way in which Pixar creates their stories. And it focuses on something called story spine. This idea of story spine, like the core part of your story, or in this case, the core part of your presentation, is something that's frequently taught in film schools like USC or NYU. Really, almost all film studies reference this idea of story spine. And so the Pixar storytelling framework is not something that the Pixar Corporation, the company, the subsidiary of Disney, actually publishes or talks about. Emma Coates was a lead storyboard artist at Pixar from the time they were founded up until about 2014. And in 2012, she published a set of what she called the Pixar Storytelling Guidelines online in a blog post. And these have been picked up and used at film schools around the world because it really is the core of how Pixar tells movies, creates movies. And Emma Coates, you may not know her name, but you may know her work. She is the person who wrote, storyboarded, and directed the first 9 minutes of the movie Up. So that beautiful, devastating story of Ellie and Carl told almost without words, that was the work of Emma Coates. Even though she was not credited as the director for the movie, that was her work. So she really, really knows what she's talking about. So the Pixar storytelling framework goes like this. Once upon a time, and every day, until one day, and because of this, and because of that, until finally. So that's the framework. And you can see from it that it includes elements of character, conflict, pacing, reflection, all of the narrative techniques that make for great stories. So let me go into a little more detail here. So once upon a time is the context of the world, where we are, like the world that we're in, right? And every day is the current problems, how things are in the everyday life of that world, what's going on an everyday basis. And then there's an incident that launches the story. That's the until one day. And because of that incident, the character, the main character, has to go on some kind of journey. And in that journey, they encounter obstacles, things change for them. And because of that, they sort of shift their focus and shift who they are until finally there is a resolution to the story. So that's like the details of the Pixar storytelling framework. So let me talk about this, and you'll probably be able to figure this one out pretty quickly yourselves. And focusing on one of my favorite Pixar films and one that I've watched with my kids many times, and that's Finding Nemo. So once upon a time, a fish named Marlin was protective of his son Nemo, and every day Marlin warned Nemo that the world was full of danger. Until one day, Nemo ignored his dad and swam out into the sea and touched the butt. And because of this, he was captured by a diver and ended up in a fish tank. Because of that, Marlin swam across the ocean to rescue Nemo until finally Marlin found Nemo and learned that love depends on trust. And that is, so it works, right? That's the Pixar storytelling framework. You can apply it to Inside Out 2, you can apply it to the original Toy Story or any of the movies in between, and it's there, right? It's absolutely there. Yeah. Right. So the Tarzan movie with Brendan Fraser. Yeah. Once Upon a Time is powerful, right? It's part of our culture. You don't have to necessarily say it in your presentations, although you could if it's appropriate for the story. Drug misuse abatement, addiction, and all those topics that we focus on every day in our public health work. Well, the great thing about story frameworks like this is they can be applied to a lot of different situations, especially when you have to talk and get up in front of people and present an idea or seek funding from the for-profit sector or even a nonprofit where you might have to go give a presentation to them. It applies to all of these. And let me talk a little bit about this. So once upon a time is your problem or the problem you want to focus on, right? And every day there are existing solutions and why they do or don't work, right? And you can look at this historically. This also doesn't necessarily have to apply to now or something new. You can talk about why something came to be using this framework. So every day there were existing solutions, but they didn't quite work. Until one day there was a new solution, a new discovery, a new piece of research, a hypothesis, whatever it is. And because of this, things started to change. And maybe there were some challenges on the way. And because of that, your approach changed, or things improved, or there were critical roadblocks that you couldn't overcome, that were impossible to overcome, until finally you get to the current outcome there. Okay, so that's how you can apply this framework in kind of a more health science context. And let me give you a very, very kind of abbreviated example of this, talking about antibiotic resistance. So once upon a time, every time you go to the doctor, you get an antibiotic. Well, if you have any kind of infection or itch or rash or whatever, a lot of times you just get antibiotics, and you get a paper cut and you're worried it might get infected, right? So you go get an antibiotic because you don't want it to get infected. And every day, because of an overprescription of antibiotics, antimicrobial bacteria are on the rise. And here's the data to prove it, like graphs, tables, charts. Again, data is important. You just got to figure out the right places to share with it. Until one day, you, your team, your organization, your senator, your congressperson you're working for, your policy person you're working for, whoever it is, has come up with a dual-pronged strategy for reducing antibiotic overprescription and sparking new research, because we don't have a lot of research into new antibiotics. They're not profitable. So we have a limited number of tools in our arsenal to deal with microbial infections, and we need new research. So because of this dual-prong strategy, there's going to be both a reduction in antibiotic-resistant microbes and an increase in funding for new antibiotic research. And because of that, there's going to be better health outcomes for people because there's less antibiotic-resistant bacteria that are out there. And there's going to be better incentives for private research because public-private partnerships really do work, until finally we get generations of new antibiotics without living in fear that something as simple as a paper cut is going to kill us. So that's the Pixar storytelling framework at work. It's awesome. It's really useful. It can be applied in a lot of situations. Yeah, it's really great. It gives story development to something that would otherwise be kind of dull and boring, right? Policy proposals for antibiotic research there. Yeah. All right, so what I'd love for you to do, and I know this is going to be hard because this is a webinar format, and if I was in a classroom, we do things a little bit different, but I think it's still really useful. Find a piece of paper, open a Word document, whatever it is. Think about an interview you're working on. And I'd like you to very briefly, you don't have to get through the whole thing, but at least the kind of first couple of steps, and I'll bring it back up on the screen, apply the Pixar storytelling framework, to that project, imagining you're going to present at a PTA meeting. Imagine your audience is a PTA meeting, and this is an intervention project that you're currently working on, and apply the Pixar storytelling framework to that, okay? So here's the framework, right? Here's the framework right here. The 5 steps. I don't expect that everybody will be able to get through this, but if you can, I would love for you to just spend, we're going to spend, I'll start the clock. We'll spend 3 minutes just trying to get through the first couple of these here. Just think about how you might use this. And then after the 3 minutes are done, I'd love for you, if you can, when we're down to 3 minutes, just type what you got into the text chat there, and we'll see what we have for everybody. I know this is weird. Zoom is not the ideal environment for this. We could theoretically do breakout rooms, but that doesn't really work in the webinar when there's a couple hundred people here like there are today. But just give it some practice. You must have worked on an intervention. You must have worked on a project where this framework might apply. You must be familiar at least with one, I hope. And again, you can use pieces of paper. I love to write things on paper. Once upon a time, you wanted to add a free library. Go with it. Go with it, Ermelinda. Keep going. I'd love to see it. Because if we can just a little bit of practice goes a long way in getting this, in making this part of your storytelling process. This might not be the right framework for you, and that's okay. I'm not saying this is this framework you should use for everything at all, right? Everything at all. Oh, I'm sorry, Katrina. Yeah, I was just thinking PTA, meaning an audience of non-experts, right? And it could be depending on the location of the kid's school, very different backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, education levels. But really the idea is to target it to people who don't necessarily have a degree or advanced studies in the same field that you're going to be talking about there. Yeah. Until one day we ran out of books. Yeah, right. Funding for books. Absolutely. And every day people offered to bring their old books, but they had outdated views and no diversity. Excellent. Excellent. Framing it in conflict, Ermelinda, framing it in conflict, right? This is great, but we're missing something really, really key. You're missing out. That's a conflict, right? I want something. We need something. We're not getting it. That's awesome. Right, Margaret, once upon a time, there was a world where cultural barriers to vaccine access existed. Absolutely. Still do. Right, Jacqueline. Once upon a time, addiction was out of control in our community. It's a great start. And every day there were solutions around, I don't know, needle exchange programs or, oh, I've forgotten the name of the drug that's the alternative, methadone, right? Methadone clinics, but they weren't working, right? Something like that. Ashley, great. Once upon a time, anxiety and depression were on the rise in our teens. Absolutely. Let's see, Ronnie. In 1980s, people were experiencing severe pain with no solutions. People were experiencing chronic back pain, chronic pain, back pain, arthritic pain. And there were no medications that physicians could prescribe to address this pain because strong pain medications were reserved for end-of-life advanced cancer patients. I see where you're going. That is awesome. So this is a technique sort of you call like upending audience expectations, right? So I assume, Ronnie, you'd go on to talk about how opioids were then introduced to deal with chronic back pain because people thought they were a good thing. Or you could say, not even mention opioids, say, and we found that these really powerful pain relievers that really help people a lot, right? And so people are like, oh, this is going on a happy path. And the moment you mention fentanyl, the moment you mention opioids, you are completely surprising your audience and giving them that twist, right? People talked at the beginning of the presentation about that twist, and that's great. So sometimes setting people up for one thing and then completely upending their expectations is another great technique to be using. And you can use it within the same kind of framework. Right, parents not being involved. Parents complain, their kid was involved. There's bullying, rules get changed, and teachers and parents start paying attention. Absolutely, these are awesome. Right. because of, right, and because of the rise of opioid deaths, we're now able to receive Narcan over the counter to help reduce harm. Absolutely. These are great. Let's see. Once upon a time, pregnant people were excluded from receiving prescription medications to treat opioid and use disorder or alcohol use disorder. And everyday substance use related deaths and complications among pregnant people and their babies are substantially increasing until one day medical experts and the CDC declared medication-assisted treatment to be a safe and effective treatment for people and the fetus. That's awesome. Thank you, Amanda. That is perfect. And so again, once upon a time, right? You don't need to say once upon a time and every day until one day. This is about structuring your stories and your storytelling. These are awesome, 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 awesome. Melissa, once upon a time, there was a lonely grant writer who was tasked with making sure that there are enough resources within a local health department. Good luck with that. And every day, there are new fires that need to be put out, but grant report deadlines still come and go. Yes, they do. Until one day, she learned to delegate tasks and say no. I love this story, Melissa. This is the story of my life. I've only recently learned how to delegate tasks in my life in an effective way, and I'm 55, and that was great. And because of this, her mind was at peace and she walked out the door. And because of that, more people in her office recognized that there was more work than a part-time person could do on their own. And if this didn't work, didn't get done, they don't get paid. Until finally the light went on and more people have taken ownership of this daunting responsibility. That is awesome. I love that. That's a great personal story to share with everybody. All right, so there's lots of these here. I see you're doing, this is awesome. I wish I could go through all of these, but I think you all can read them in the chat faster than I can read them aloud here, because I have a couple more things I want to cover before we get to Q&A there. Christine says, can I give an example of one without an easy solution? Well, I think you talk about, for example, the problem of being unhoused, of homelessness in this country. You could talk about, for example, if you're talking about a specific case study, that, like, for example, San Francisco, there was a period of time where they gave unhoused people credit card machines so that people wouldn't give them cash, but they could tip them with credit cards. And it was a disaster. It was a project that did not work out. And the city spent millions and millions of dollars on that. And you can use the same framework to talk about that, what the problem was, how they thought they were doing the right thing, and how it kind of blew up in their faces, right? So it didn't have it because it doesn't have an easy solution there. So yeah, it's definitely, it works with both. Yeah, it works with both. All right, thank you. These are awesome, and I wish I had time to read them all aloud. That's really, really, really difficult. Yeah, they're great. Keeping hope is tough sometimes, Christine. Not all stories are happy. There aren't always positive solutions. But I tell my students, where possible, try to find that glimmer of hope. Try to find new things. Again, the problem with homelessness in this country is so bad and so devastating, and there aren't any good solutions. But if there are signs of hope and new ideas and new approaches that are being engaged in, talk about those, finish up with those, give them hope. Harvey Milk said, you got to give them hope, right? Even in the darkest of times, even when things look really bad, you got to give them hope. Otherwise, people will give up. So I'm a firm believer that if we're possible, even with really difficult topics that don't have easy solutions, showing where things might improve can make an audience want to be engaged with that there. Yeah. Yeah, and for some issues, absolutely, Jenna, we're still at the until one day, right? Maybe we have to stop there sometimes. But again, this sort of the framework would work for both completely the whole story and parts of it as well. It's all about framing, organizing, creating conflict, narrative, reflection, all those other things there. Awesome. These are awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all those with me. But I do want to move on because I know we got to finish at 3:30. So I will say to each and every one of you, other than thank you for these amazing, amazing applications of the Pixar storytelling framework, I will say that none of this truly works. None of this truly works without rehearsal. You gotta rehearse every presentation you give. None of this, in terms of being an effective presenter, an engaging presenter, knowing how to flip things up, knowing how to take pauses and take breaks, and knowing how to come in on time, none of this works without preparation and rehearsal. The key to a great not even a good presentation, but a great presentation is rehearsal. When you rehearse, when you practice it, you won't hear the crazy, malformed, misshapen things that come out of your mouth if you don't practice, right? We're all terrified of flubbing, of freezing up, of saying the wrong thing. But when you practice, you significantly reduce the likelihood of that happening. And also, very importantly, as we're saying earlier, you'll know if your content fits to time, right? You practice and you're like, wow, my presentation is supposed to be 20 minutes and I ran 46 minutes. I got to cut some stuff. Rehearse and you'll know if your content fits to time. You know, great presenters who are great storytellers didn't get that way without practicing each and every story, each and every presentation, right? Comedians, when you see somebody do a special on Netflix or HBO Max, or you go to a concert, they don't just get up and tell funny stories. No, they work and they work and they work. They practice, they rehearse every joke over and over and over again until they get it right. They bomb, they're terrible, they're not funny at all until they figure out the right way for a joke to work, the right way for a joke to land, and they do it again and they do it again. And then when they get up in front of a large audience in an arena or doing a special for HBO or Netflix or whatever, then they deliver it and you're like, that person's so amazingly funny. They are not that way on their own. They practice and they practice and they practice. And neuroscience, I keep going back to neuroscience because it's so powerful as a discipline when you're talking about communication, shows that, you know, it needs to be deliberate practice, not just rote rehearsal, not just like, okay, I'm going to think this in my head and then I'm going to say this and I'm going to say that. No, it needs to be deliberate practice with attention to the task at hand, rehearsing with a clear goal in mind, repeating the process with purpose to make sure you're going to be able to deliver it with as much passion, as much clarity, and as much focus as you possibly can so that your audience is engaged and focused. You know, I mean, yeah, you can just dump a bunch of information into slides at the last minute. PowerPoint absolutely allows you to do that, but it's not going to be effective. And again, just thinking it in your head without saying it out loud is also not effective. Get up, get out of your chair if you're going to be doing stuff on Zoom. I do that all the time. Rehearsal breeds confidence. People are terrified of delivering a presentation. Rehearsal breeds confidence. It reduces that terror. It makes you aware of everything you can say and allows you to adapt to the weird things that do happen in your presentation. So rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. Yeah, same thing, Tracy. Read your papers to find the mistakes, right? Read them out loud. It makes such a difference because you're like, wow. And also, this is a really important thing. We write very differently than we speak. And a lot of times when I teach my students, I can tell it's very obvious when a student is literally reading from a script, because sometimes they're like looking down at their paper and they're reading from a script, or it sounds robotic and rehearsed, or it sounds alien and weird because they're reading like they're speaking like they would write. And as human beings, we don't speak like we write at all. We don't do that. We use these very formal sentence structures, particularly in academia and in the health sciences, that we never would use when we're talking to another person. And we want to make sure that that comes across as sort of as improvisational as possible. And rehearsal will help you do that. All right. Few resources before we go and I get to Q&A. 3 books I want to tell you about. 3 books. First of all, Presentation Zen by Gar Reynolds is an amazing book that changed my life. I think everybody who ever teaches, everybody who has to ever get up in front of an audience and present needs to read this book. Not only is it a great book about visual design for presentations, making simple, clear slides for your audience, it's also about connecting to your audience as a human being, something we often forget to do. Gar Reynolds is a great author. This book is wonderful. He's the guy who taught Steve Jobs how to present. Steve Jobs from Apple Computer of the reality distortion field, a legendary presenter who could make people buy almost anything or make it seem like the most incredible invention in the world. And Gar Reynolds was the guy who taught him how to present. The next one I want to recommend is Demystifying Public Speaking by Lara Hogan. Lara Hogan used to be the chief technical officer at Etsy, the I buy it, you make it, I make it, you buy it online website, ETSY, Etsy, great website. She was their chief technical officer, and she wrote this book because women in particular have real challenges in STEM fields with presenting. You've got mansplaining, you've got aggressive questioners or non-questioners, and you've got people who don't believe you know what you're talking about. You've got simple stuff like the tech guy comes up to you and says, hey, I need to wire you up with the lavalier mic through your blouse. What do you do? She offers great practical advice on not just speaking, but how to break into the speaking circuit, no matter what discipline you're in. This book is available for free. And yeah, you're definitely, as Rebecca just put in, you're going to get a copy of the slides, or they're already available now. This link is in those slides. And the last book I want to recommend is Better Presentations by Jonathan Schwabish. This is an awesome book. This is the book I use as my textbook in a couple of the classes that I teach. It's a great book. If you want, like, you're like, okay, Brian, show me the data, show me the science, show me the journal articles, the studies. This book has citations galore about the very same things that I'm talking about here today, and then some, and a lot of really beautiful visual examples, as well. Effie, if you're interested in my classes, you can go to, gosh, I'm going to put in here, type in a link here. There you go. That's the course catalog at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. My classes are actually open to anybody. You just have to pay for them. You can take a class on a one-off basis. I love teaching these courses. They're super fun for me. But anyways, this book is a great, densely packed, full of visuals and journal references. All the sort of like science of better presentations is in this book. I really, really, really recommend it. Finally, last thing I want to mention about better design. And if you want to stand out in your presentations, if you want people to remember you, I'm not a designer at all. I am a terrible designer, bad designer, can't do it. I buy professional templates. I do. This is a great and easy way for you to stand out from all your peers at a conference, or if you go giving presentations over the course of a month in your office, whatever it is. Buy a professional template from places like Envato. Envato.com has thousands of professional templates. They're $5, $10, maybe $15. It's a great investment because they'll create things that are really visually beautiful with lots of different slide layouts that you would probably never be able to do yourself. They don't look like everybody else's PowerPoint presentations, and they will make you stand out. Afterwards, people will be like, I really like the way your presentation looked. Hopefully they say they really like the content of your presentation, but if it helps them remember you in a crowded conference, that's a win for you. That's going to help you with your network and help you stand out professionally. And you'll notice I use a lot of images. I use a lot of images in my presentations, along with some very simple text or data visualizations. There's a lot of great sites for finding images. I really love unsplash.com. Unsplash.com has a wide variety of Creative Commons license, that's publicly, freely, availably licensed images. You basically just have to give credit to people, and a really super diverse set of images. It's not all white folks in the office, right? Which a lot of free images are that are out there. Really diverse, taken by people all over the world. Really beautiful, beautiful images. Yeah, Brenda, Unsplash. I haven't used Pexels or Pixabay yet. I tend to focus on Unsplash because I get so much good stuff from them and so many beautiful images there. Google Images is great as well, but you got to check the license, because remember, if you are, say, giving a presentation at a conference and they're going to sell access to those recordings, to your presentations after the fact, you are liable for any copyright on those images. I'm not saying you're going to get found out and someone's going to come after you for copyright infringement, but you're liable for that. So you want to use licenses that are Creative Commons, free, open, anyone can use them. Unsplash has lots of them. And also, one more pro tip: always use images that are more than 1,000 pixels in at least one dimension. We've all, those stretched out, small, blurry images that people find this tiny little image on the web, and then they stretch it and make it big, and it's on a 60-foot screen. Just looks unprofessional. Always make sure your images are at least 1,000 pixels in at least one dimension, and your images will look a lot better. And don't fear the blank template. I use the blank template a lot, right? A simple white slide, not a lot on it, helps the audience focus again on that right piece of information. So I hope, and I promise I'm going to get to Q&A and some stuff that came up in the text chat there. I really, really hope that you're going to take a couple of the techniques from today and create more compelling experiences when you present to your partners and to your peers. So thank you so much. That's it for my main presentation. I'm going to definitely dive into the Q&A in the 12 minutes that we have here. I really, really, really loved spending my time with you today. You were a great group, super active, super involved. This is super cool. If you have questions, if you could type them in the Q&A, that would be ideal for me, because that's where I'm going to start really at this point here. So I'm going to go back to the Q&A here, and the first question that came in pretty early on into the, thank you for the kind words, appreciate it, I'm going to stop sharing my slides here because I'm going to focus on Q&A. Does my approach address all 7 learning styles? Like no text, no bullets, what about visual learner who struggles with auditory? So I am not a big believer in learning styles. The idea of learning styles has largely been debunked in the educational literature. I do agree, though, that different people have learning preferences. There are people who are absolutely hands-on kinesthetic learners. There are absolutely people who prefer to read. There are people who prefer to talk things out, 1,000%. And I will say that my approach is specifically about traditional didactic delivery of core information to an audience, and that presentations aren't the best way to learn. That mixing things up with activities, like I did the Pixar storytelling activity in the middle of the presentation today, because I know how important it is not just to sort of break things up, but to apply in a very active way what we are talking about in our presentations. It's a style of teaching or sort of sharing of didactic information called active learning. Using those strategies, I'm 1,000% behind it. This won't work for everybody in every style, but you can't. I mean, the reality is that people are so diverse and so interesting and different and unique that you can't make it work for everybody in the room all the time. We do our best, given the constraints that we work under. But yeah, I am leaving some people out, and I am leaving some people behind with this, particularly kinesthetic learners, because there isn't really a hands-on way to do this other than, like, say, in the classes that I teach, where a lot of the emphasis is on building and delivering presentations, which is a much more sort of active kinesthetic experience for them. So I hope that answers your question, Allison. Okay, so next up, someone wanted to know, what are other options for creating presentations besides PowerPoint? I love Keynote on the Mac. It's really good. I think that Google Presentations is good, but has some real accessibility issues, especially if you need to send out the slides later on. It will not create an accessible PDF. It will not create an accessible PowerPoint. I really would discourage folks from using Google Presentations if they want to create accessible materials. A lot of people like Prezi. My issue with Prezi is that it's so heavily focused on animations, zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out. It's difficult to pay attention. There was actually a study that was done about 10 years ago, about 2 years after Prezi came out as a software tool, as a presentation tool, that showed that they showed a bunch of Prezi presentations to a series of adult learners over the age of 30, and over half of them had motion sickness after about 20 minutes because of the endless zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out, Prezi. Canva is a good tool. Yeah, Canva is a good tool. Again, a tool is what you make of it and how you use it. The tool isn't going to make you a better presenter. It's the stories you choose to tell and how you choose to display and convey your information that's going to make the presentation work or not. All right, so Dominic's question that I wanted to get to, how important are introductions at the beginning of a presentation? I was in a training yesterday and they spent the first hour, oh my God, having everyone introduce themselves, then had to rush through the material. Absolutely. I am not, I think you're going to get your audience's attention, and you're going to hold their attention if you just start talking. You really will. Think about it. You're at a conference, you're in a meeting, people have their phones, their laptops. You've got maybe less than a minute to grab and hold their attention because they've got so many other things they could do, right? If it's a conference, they've got maybe 10 other sessions they can go to. If it's a work thing, they're going to be checking their email, not paying attention to you. It's important to share your personal experiences. And what I tell my students, what I try to do is I launch into my presentations, I get going right away because, as someone earlier said, get to the good stuff, please. But I talk about myself while I am going over the content, my experience with it, my knowledge, my understanding, my reflection, my personal reflection back to the topic. And that tells people who I am as a person. And that, I think, is a much more effective way to weave it throughout your presentation, because it ties you to the topic and makes the topic much more relatable, because you as a human being are sharing what you feel about that. Hopefully that answers your question. Let's see. Jeff says, does pace mean the same thing as pacing? Yeah, absolutely. Pacing, the same thing. How quickly you go, the rapidity through which you get through content, varying it, breaking it up, right? So it's not all fast, or slow, slow. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Colleen wants to know, how do you handle keeping PowerPoint content brief when you need to cover a lot of dense information and need to make sure that people can process it? Yeah, so that's a really good question, Colleen. I tend to again, try to really focus on, especially if it's dense information, what are the key ideas? What's the key things? I rigorously eliminate any secondary and tertiary information, right? Because if it's a lot of dense information, like you're doing a technical training, get rid of all that secondary, tertiary stuff. It needs to be about what do you want to know? And then frequently, and I mean like every 7 minutes or so, ask review questions. Do a poll if it's on Zoom that sort of says, okay, we talked about this. Now, what's this? A pop quiz, right? Even though it doesn't count for anything. Ask questions, make sure the audience is caught up, give them an opportunity to practice and apply it. That will break apart that deep technical information in a way that's easier for them to process overall and reinforces what you just learned. Because if you just dump information, which sometimes I know you're using somebody else's slide deck, it's a mandated training by the state or the federal government, or even the organization you work for, that can be really tough. But if you can find ways of breaking that apart, allowing for interaction and doing review questions, that can make a really, really good way of helping them process all the data. Yeah, that's my thought on it. Hopefully that answers your question, Colleen. Melissa wants to know, Ignite presentations or Pechakucha or lightning talks. So this is actually an exercise I give my students to do in my classes. It is really hard. So when Melissa's talking about in her question here is you would have, say, you go to a conference, an assignment, a presentation, whatever, and you are given very rigorous constraints, on what you can, how you can present. 20 slides, 15 seconds a slide for a total of 5 minutes on stage. That is super hard to do. It is, if you want to become a better presenter, I would absolutely say practice that method. It's difficult, it's challenging. You really have to think about how am I going to communicate exactly what I need to communicate. You really have to think about how much time am I spending on an individual slide. And you really got to practice, because you can't do that with exactly 15 seconds on a slide without a lot of practice. And it's a great academic exercise. I do not think it's effective when you are getting up in front of an audience of peers, of community partners at a conference. You need the flexibility to build out the story in a way that makes the most sense to you as a presenter. So that kind of rigorous framework is a great exercise, but it doesn't necessarily make for great presentations here. And I got time for one more question here. Yeah, so Lindsay wants to know, how can we kick off the Pixar framework without using once upon a time? Just start talking about the issue. Again, you don't have to use those words. You don't have to say once upon a time until whatever. Just that's a sort of a prompt for you to think about how you might want to use it. Let's see. Was there a question about canned presentation materials in here? I can't see it here. Sorry. Maybe I'm going to take the questions that didn't get answered because I'm really out of time and I got to turn it back over to Rebecca. Put the questions in the Q&A that I didn't ask, please. And I told Chris and Rebecca that I will answer those in email, and you'll get a copy of that email and a copy of those questions. So I got to turn it back to Rebecca. Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed this, and I hope you have an awesome and great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Brian. And it's actually me. I'm going to go ahead and take over at this point. But no problem. Thank you so much, Brian. Fantastic training. Once again, I've seen you before, but I wrote another 3 pages of notes. So thank you,
Excellent.
thank you. For you all, I wanted to make sure everybody knew about some upcoming trainings that we are offering through the Great Lakes PTTC. We have one coming up on July 11th that's for a different focus population than we usually are working with for these webinars. It's for peer recovery specialists and those peer recovery specialists who are interested in doing work in the primary prevention arena. So that's coming up July 11th. July 16th, we're going to talk about the loneliness epidemic and the impact of social connectedness on our health and well-being, and what we can do as prevention professionals in this arena. August 7th, we have training for those working on higher ed campuses, preventing substance misuse on college campuses. August 27th, this training will fill up. So if you're interested in participating in this, I would sign up right away. Effective group facilitation skills for prevention professionals. September 5th, We are going to talk about CSAP 6 strategies, and I'm guessing that most people who work in prevention are familiar with these, but we're going to dive deeper into them in terms of what are effective efforts that you can do within each category of the CSAP 6 strategies and what are ineffective in those categories. On September 12th, we're going to focus on environmental strategies for substance misuse prevention. That's a 3-hour training. And then last but not least, if you are working on becoming a certified prevention specialist and are wanting help preparing for the exam, highly recommend that you join us with Nicole Augustine on September 19th. So a few things coming up. If you haven't followed us or liked and followed us on social media, and if you use those platforms, highly recommend that you do that. We aim to post every day, and this is the way that we get information out to you on a really quick basis. You know, we have our weekly emails that we send out, but this is something that as information comes up, we can get it to you right away. And I did post during the training today the link to the recording and PowerPoint slides for this presentation. So that's something that if you want to forward it to other folks, you can use that, that post to forward on to folks. And with that, just one last reminder to complete the evaluation form that you'll be redirected to at the end of this webinar. It's greatly helpful for us in terms of how we look at what we're going to offer in the future, what worked well, what didn't, etc. I do read every single comment, so please know that it doesn't go into a black hole. And with that, any last comments, Brian or Rebecca?
Just thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And I will follow up with those Q&A questions that I didn't get to.
Thank you so much, Brian, again. Fantastic,
Thanks for having me.
Fantastic training. Yes. And I've lots of comments of Brian needs to come back. We need a part 2, et cetera, et cetera. We will see what we can do because I agree.
Thanks.
Fantastic training.
Appreciate
All right.
it.
Take care, everyone. Have a great
Bye,
rest of your
everybody.
day.